If you've spent any time looking at photographs of 19th century buildings, you might have noticed something. The structures are large. Remarkably large. And they appear with a consistency that spans continents. From San Francisco to St. Petersburg, from Chicago to Melbourne, similar architectural elements show up during roughly the same decades. High ceilings. Ornate facades. Basement windows that sit half buried in the ground. Identical decorative patterns on buildings separated by oceans. This isn't about promoting a particular theory. It's about acknowledging that when people look at these buildings today, questions arise. Those questions don't come from nowhere. They come from observable features that seem, at first glance, difficult to reconcile with what we understand about the period in which they were built. The standard historical narrative tells us these structures were products of the Industrial Revolution, built rapidly during an era of expansion and technological progress. And yet, when you examine construction timelines, labor force records, and the tools available at the time, certain aspects of this narrative feel stretched. Not impossible. Just stretched. Take the World's Fairs, for instance. Massive exhibition halls, some covering acres, were reportedly constructed in months and then demolished shortly after. The official explanation is that they were temporary structures, built with staff and plaster. But photographs from the period show buildings that look anything but temporary. They look permanent. Solid. Built to last. Or consider the repeated accounts of buried first floors. In cities across North America and Europe, basement windows appear at street level or below. The standard explanation involves landfill, street raising, and urban development. Reasonable enough. But when this same pattern appears in city after city, across different climates, geographies, and administrative systems, it invites closer examination. The term, Tartaria, has become shorthand for a collection of these observations. The word itself appears on maps from the 18th and 19th centuries, referring to regions of Central Asia. Whether it described a unified political entity, or simply a geographical designation remains debated among historians. What's not debated is that the term existed in official cartography, and then largely disappeared from use. The reason this topic generates ongoing interest isn't because of any single piece of evidence. It's because of patterns. Repeated features that appear across time and space in ways that feel coordinated, even when conventional history suggests they shouldn't be. When someone notices that buildings in cities that had little contact with each other share nearly identical architectural elements, that's not a baseless observation. It's a pattern that demands explanation. And here's the thing about patterns: they can be explained in multiple ways. The conventional explanation involves shared architectural trends, international exhibitions, pattern books, and the rapid dissemination of ideas during a period of global trade. That explanation works for much of what we see. But not all of it. There are edges where the explanation frays. Construction timelines that seem impossibly compressed. Technological capabilities that appear advanced for their stated time period. Gaps in documentation where we might expect thorough records. This script won't tell you what to believe about these observations. What it will do is present them in sequence, starting with what can be measured and documented, moving through historical records, and ending with questions that remain genuinely open. The goal is transparency. Show the evidence. Acknowledge the gaps. Let you decide where conventional explanations suffice and where they leave room for doubt. Because whether you accept the standard historical account or suspect something more complex occurred, the buildings themselves remain. The photographs exist. The maps are real. The timelines are documented. What we make of those facts is where interpretation begins. And interpretation, done carefully, isn't about asserting hidden truths. It's about asking better questions. So let's start with what we can see. The buildings themselves are the starting point. Not theories about them. Not interpretations. Just the structures as they exist in photographs, architectural surveys, and surviving examples. One of the most frequently noted features is scale. Structures built during the mid to late 1800s often reach heights and occupy footprints that seem disproportionate to the populations they served. The Salt Lake City and County building, completed in 1894, contains over 400,000 square feet of floor space. The city's population at the time was approximately 50,000 people. The building required nearly a decade to complete using documented construction methods. Similar examples exist in dozens of cities across North America. Now look at the architectural consistency. Buildings from this period, across widely separated locations, share specific design elements. Classical columns. Arched windows arranged in precise symmetrical patterns. Ornamental cornices with nearly identical molding profiles. Dome structures with proportions that mirror each other. This consistency appears not just within regions, but across continents. Standard architectural history attributes this to the Beaux-Arts movement and the dissemination of pattern books. Architects trained in European schools brought standardized designs to growing cities worldwide. That's documented. What's less clear is how rapidly and completely these designs spread, especially to frontier regions with limited access to trained architects. Then there's the basement question. In city after city, structures feature windows and doorways that now sit partially or fully below ground level. The conventional explanation involves urban development. Streets were raised, valleys filled, infrastructure expanded. Over time, ground levels changed, and what was once a first floor became a basement. But examine the specifics. In Seattle, entire blocks were raised 12 to 30 feet after the Great Fire of 1889. The work took years and involved documented engineering efforts. Yet in photographs from other cities, similar elevation changes appear without corresponding documentation of massive regrading projects. Buildings show identical patterns of buried floors whether they're in coastal cities, inland towns, or mountainous regions. The construction timelines present another area worth examining. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, 1893, covered over 600 acres and included more than 200 buildings. Official records state the majority were constructed in approximately 2 years. The labor forces documented thousands of workers, operating with the technology available in the early 1890s. Plaster over wood framing for most structures, designed to be temporary. Photographs from the exposition show something different. The buildings appear solid. Masonry-like? Permanent in character. The Court of Honor, the manufacturers and liberal arts building these structures displayed a level of architectural refinement that seems remarkable for temporary construction. And then they were demolished. Nearly all of them, within months of the exposition's close. This pattern repeats. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. The Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, 1898. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904. Massive building projects completed on compressed timelines, used briefly, then destroyed. The official explanation remains consistent: temporary structures, always intended for demolition. But the photographs remain, showing buildings that don't look temporary. Technological capability is another factor. By the 1880s and 1890s, construction technology had advanced significantly. Steel frame construction, power tools, improved concrete. These innovations are well documented. What's less clear is the rate at which they were deployed in cities across the American West, in Australia, and South America. The buildings exist. The dates are recorded. But the detailed construction records, the day-by-day accounts of how these structures went up, are often sparse or missing entirely. Consider the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles, completed in 1893. 5 stories of ornate ironwork, a skylit atrium, open-cage elevators, glazed brick, Italian marble. The building was designed by a draftsman with no formal architectural training and constructed in less than a year. It remains standing today, a National Historic Landmark. The official account attributes its construction to skilled craftsmen and standard techniques of the period. That may be accurate. But the timeline and the level of detail achieved in that timeline invite questions. Or look at the Carson Mansion in Eureka, California, built between 1884 and 1886. An 18-room Victorian home featuring a blend of architectural styles: Queen Anne, Eastlake, Italianate with intricate woodwork throughout. The mansion was reportedly built by workers from the Carson Lumber Company during slow periods. 2 years of intermittent labor produced one of the most elaborate residential structures in America. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The timeline is documented. The two facts sit together uncomfortably. The photographic record from this period provides another layer of evidence. Early photographs of cities show development that appears nearly complete. Streets are paved. Buildings are finished. Infrastructure is in place. But records of urban growth often describe these same cities as frontier towns just years earlier. The visual record and the documentary record don't always align smoothly. Maps add to this. Historical maps from the 18th and early 19th centuries frequently label large regions of Asia as Tartary, or variations thereof. Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. These weren't fringe documents. They were produced by established cartographers and appeared in official atlases. By the late 19th century, the term had largely vanished from maps. The regions didn't disappear. The label did. Why the change occurred, and whether it reflected political shifts or something else, remains a topic historians debate. What we have, then, is a collection of observable facts. Large buildings constructed quickly. Architectural consistency across vast distances. Basement levels that appear with regularity. Photographic evidence that sometimes conflicts with written timelines. Technological achievements that push against the boundaries of documented capabilities. None of this proves any particular theory. But it establishes that the questions people ask aren't baseless. They're rooted in things you can see and measure. Now we turn to the documents. What do official records say about these structures, and where do those records fall silent? Construction permits, when they exist, provide dates and basic specifications. But detailed records of labor, materials, and methods are often absent. For major public buildings from the late 1800s, you might find cornerstone ceremonies and completion dates, but the months or years between can be sparsely documented. Private construction records are even less complete. Fires, floods, administrative changes, many potential explanations exist for missing documentation. But the gaps remain. Take the California state capitol in Sacramento. Construction began in 1860 and concluded in 1874. 14 years. Records describe work stoppages, funding issues, changes in contractors. The timeline makes sense given those obstacles. But compare that to structures built in similar periods without documented obstacles, completed in a fraction of the time. The variance is notable. World's Fair records provide some of the most complete documentation we have for large-scale construction projects of this era. The Chicago World's Fair generated thousands of pages of reports, photographs, and correspondence. We know who the architects were. We have labor statistics. We have cost breakdowns. And yet, certain details remain unclear. How exactly were some of the larger structures erected so quickly? What specific construction methods allowed for the speed of completion? The records say it happened. They're less clear on precisely how. The same pattern appears with demolition. The official explanation for why exposition buildings were torn down is straightforward. They were never meant to be permanent. Built for display, not longevity. But in several cases, buildings that were reportedly temporary outlasted their intended lifespan and had to be actively demolished. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, built for the 1915 exposition, was meant to be torn down. Public outcry saved it. It required complete reconstruction in the 1960s, yes, but the original structure stood for decades beyond its intended use. If it was genuinely temporary, built with materials designed to last months, how did it persist for years? Population records add another layer of context. Cities that constructed massive civic buildings often had populations that seemed small relative to the scale of construction. This isn't necessarily problematic. Governments build for projected growth. Civic pride drives investment in infrastructure. But when you calculate the labor force required to build these structures against the available workforce in cities of 20,000 or 30,000 people, the numbers get tight. Not impossible. Just tight. Immigration and labor records sometimes help fill in gaps. Large-scale construction in the American West relied heavily on immigrant labor: Chinese, Irish, Italian, Eastern European workers. These populations are documented. What's less clear is how quickly they could be mobilized, trained, and deployed on complex architectural projects. Skilled stonework, ornate plasterwork, precision ironwork — these aren't tasks performed by unskilled labor. Where did the craftsmen come from? How were they trained? In some cases, we have answers. In others, the records are thin. Maps from the 18th and 19th centuries present their own documentary questions. As mentioned earlier, the term Tartary appears frequently. But what did it refer to? Some historians argue it was simply a catch-all term for regions of Central Asia that European cartographers poorly understood. Others point out that the term appears with different qualifiers: independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary, suggesting more specificity than a vague geographical label. By 1900, the term had mostly disappeared, replaced by more familiar place names: Mongolia, Turkestan, Siberia. The transition is documented. The reasons for it are debated. There are also records of what's called the Great Reset in urban planning. After major fires: Chicago in 1871, San Francisco in 1906, Seattle in 1889, cities rebuilt rapidly. The speed of reconstruction is well documented and often celebrated as a testament to human resilience and industrial capability. But examine the before and after photographs. In some cases, the rebuilt cities look more advanced, more fully realized, than they did before the fires. Infrastructure appears more complete. Buildings seem more uniform. The transformation is stark. This could reflect better planning the second time around. It could demonstrate the capabilities of industrial-era construction. Or it could point to something we don't fully understand about pre-fire conditions. The photographs exist. The dates are clear. The interpretation is where disagreement begins. Another area of documentary silence involves architectural plans. For many significant buildings from this period, original blueprints are missing. Libraries, archives, and historical societies hold some records, but comprehensive architectural plans are often absent. Fire is frequently cited as the reason. Administrative oversight. Simple loss over time. All plausible. But the absence itself is notable, especially for buildings that remain standing and in use today. We also have records of technological development that sometimes feel compressed. The Bessemer process for steel production was developed in the 1850s. By the 1880s, steel frame construction was transforming urban architecture. That's a rapid adoption curve, but not unprecedented. Electrical lighting, elevators, indoor plumbing — these technologies spread quickly in the late 19th century. The pace of change is documented. Whether the infrastructure to support that pace existed as fully as records suggest is harder to verify. Financial records provide another angle. The costs associated with major construction projects are often documented. But when you calculate inflation-adjusted costs and compare them to modern equivalents, some projects seem remarkably inexpensive. The Carson Mansion, for example, reportedly cost around $80,000 in 1886 dollars. In today's money, that's roughly $2.5 million. For an 18-room mansion with that level of detail and craftsmanship? That's low. Not impossible, given the era and available labor. But low. What we're looking at, then, is a historical record that provides answers to many questions but leaves others open. The buildings were built. The dates are clear. The methods, the labor, the precise sequence of events — those details are often less certain. And in history, as in any field, uncertainty is where investigation begins. Understanding any historical period requires understanding what life was actually like for the people living through it. The late 19th century was a time of extraordinary change. Industrialization transformed economies. Railroads connected continents. Telegraph lines enabled near-instant communication across thousands of miles. The pace of technological advancement was, by any measure, remarkable. This context matters. It explains much of what we observe. Steel production made taller buildings possible. Improved transportation allowed materials to be shipped efficiently. A growing labor force, fueled by immigration, provided the workforce needed for large-scale construction. These are documented facts, and they account for a great deal of the building boom we see in this period. But context also reveals constraints. The average worker in the 1880s labored long hours under difficult conditions. Construction work was dangerous. Safety regulations were minimal. Productivity per worker, even with improved tools, was lower than modern standards. So when we see massive structures completed in short time frames, we need to reconcile that with what we know about labor conditions and capabilities. Economic factors also play a role. The late 19th century saw cycles of boom and bust. The Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893, these were severe economic downturns that halted construction across the country. And yet, some major projects continued through these periods or resumed immediately after. Funding sources aren't always clear. Government appropriations explain some projects. Private investment accounts for others. But the flow of capital during economically unstable times raises questions about priorities and resources. There's also the matter of cultural ambition. Cities competed with each other. Civic pride drove investment in grand public buildings. World's fairs were designed to showcase national and municipal progress. The buildings weren't just functional, they were statements. That explains the scale and ornamentation. It doesn't necessarily explain the speed. Now, interpretations of this evidence vary. The conventional historical view holds that industrial capability, combined with motivated labor and ambitious leadership, made these projects possible. This view is supported by extensive documentation and is accepted by mainstream historians. It accounts for the majority of what we observe. Alternative interpretations suggest something different. Some researchers point to the consistency of architectural styles and propose the existence of a prior, more advanced civilization whose buildings were later repurposed or claimed by 19th century societies. This interpretation relies on the patterns we've discussed: buried floors, rapid construction timelines, architectural uniformity, and suggests they indicate something other than conventional industrial development. This view is not accepted by academic historians. It lacks support from primary source documents, archaeological evidence, or scholarly consensus. But it persists because the questions it attempts to answer, why certain patterns appear, why documentation is sometimes incomplete, are real questions. A third interpretation occupies middle ground. It accepts the conventional timeline but argues that our understanding of 19th century capabilities may be incomplete. Perhaps construction techniques were more advanced than we've assumed. Perhaps labor organization was more efficient. Perhaps documentation is missing not due to conspiracy but due to mundane record-keeping failures compounded over time. This view doesn't require reimagining history, but it does suggest we may not have the full picture. Where does the evidence lead? That depends on which evidence you prioritize. If you prioritize documented timelines, labor records, and economic data, the conventional view holds. If you prioritize visual evidence, photographs, architectural surveys, observable patterns, alternative interpretations gain traction. If you focus on gaps in documentation, you might conclude that something is missing from the conventional narrative without necessarily knowing what. This is where careful analysis becomes critical. We can observe that basement windows appear frequently. We can document that street levels changed in many cities. We can note that the timelines for those changes aren't always clear. What we can't do is leap from observation to conclusion without considering context. Buried floors might indicate advanced prior construction. Or they might indicate urban development that's poorly documented. Both explanations fit the observable facts. Neither is proven by those facts alone. The role of bias also matters here. If you approach this evidence expecting to find proof of a hidden civilization, you'll interpret ambiguities as confirmation. If you approach it expecting conventional explanations to suffice, you'll dismiss anomalies as outliers. The evidence itself doesn't change. How we frame it does. What's valuable, then, is to hold multiple possibilities in mind. To say, here's what we can document. Here's where documentation ends. Here are plausible explanations. And here's what remains uncertain. That approach doesn't give you definitive answers, but it gives you honest ones. Because history isn't a solved puzzle. It's an ongoing investigation. New sources emerge. New analytical methods develop. What seemed settled can become unsettled. What seemed mysterious can become clear. The key is to remain open to evidence while resisting the urge to overinterpret it. So where does this leave us? We have buildings that exist. We have photographs that document them. We have timelines that place their construction in specific periods. And we have questions about how all of this fits together. Some of those questions have clear answers. How was the Eiffel Tower built? We know. Detailed records exist. The engineering is documented. The labor force is accounted for. No mystery there. Other questions remain open. How were some World's Fair structures built so quickly? Why do basement windows appear with such regularity across different cities? Why did the term, Tartaria, disappear from maps? These aren't unanswerable questions. But the answers we have don't always feel complete. What matters is how we approach these gaps. We can treat them as invitations to investigate further. To look for primary sources. To examine building techniques of the period more closely. To seek out records that might clarify timelines. That's productive inquiry. Or we can treat gaps as evidence of something hidden. As proof that the official story is false. That's less productive, because it starts with a conclusion and works backward. It makes investigation secondary to validation. The truth is likely more mundane than either conspiracy theories or conventional history suggests. Buildings were constructed using methods that were advanced for their time but not impossible. Documentation is incomplete because record-keeping was inconsistent, and much has been lost to time. Patterns appear across locations because architectural trends spread through training, publication, and cultural exchange. These explanations aren't exciting. But they fit the evidence without requiring speculation. And yet, the questions persist. Not because people are foolish or gullible, but because observable details genuinely invite explanation. When you see the same architectural elements repeated across continents, it's reasonable to ask why. When you read construction timelines that seem compressed, it's reasonable to wonder how. Curiosity isn't a flaw. It's the starting point for understanding. What this examination has tried to do is present evidence clearly. To show you what can be measured, what's documented, and what remains uncertain. The goal hasn't been to persuade you of a particular theory, but to equip you to evaluate claims critically. If you're interested in this topic, look at primary sources. Examine photographs from the period. Read construction records where they exist. Visit surviving buildings if you can. The evidence is accessible. It doesn't require special access or insider knowledge. It's there for anyone willing to engage with it seriously. History isn't a fixed narrative. It's a conversation. New evidence emerges. New interpretations develop. What we thought we knew can change. That's not a weakness of historical study. It's a strength. It means we're willing to revise our understanding when facts demand it. The buildings remain. The photographs exist. The questions are real. What we make of them is up to us. And the best way forward is careful observation, honest evaluation, and a willingness to say, I don't know. Uncertainty isn't justified. Because sometimes, the most honest answer is that the story isn't finished.